Hey everyone, this is a Gibson Les Paul. There are many like it, but this one is mine. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Sadly, in truth, this one is not my Gibson Les Paul. I don't actually own a Gibson Les Paul because, frankly, I can't afford one. This gorgeous 2012 Honeyburst Les Paul Standard belongs to my good buddy Sean. Hi, Sean. Who pretty much lends it to me whenever I may need it. We affectionately refer to this guitar as Leslie. And for the past 8 to 10 months or so, Leslie has been pretty much living with me. Sean has an amazing guitar collection, one that I'm very jealous of. Have a look at this. But Sean fancies himself an acoustic and Telecaster player, first and foremost. So as a result, and much to my good fortune, Sean loves to see the guitars that he doesn't play so much, like this Gibson Les Paul, in good and capable hands and getting played on a regular basis. And shown off just as regularly here on my YouTube channel. So thank you, Sean, very much for being so awesome and letting me have your Les Paul way more often than you seem to have it lately. I will give it back, I promise. I just need it for a couple more years will do just fine. Anyway, onward. The Gibson Les Paul, that famous and iconic beast of a guitar, born and first created in 1952 by company president Ted McCarty, factory manager John Hewis, and their team, plus a fair amount of input from the man himself, who the guitar is named for, the legendary Les Paul, seeking to create a guitar to compete with the new solid body guitars that Fender were starting to produce in the early 50s, and having great success with, especially with the Fender Telecaster. McCarty, Hewis, and their team set to work, and after a year or so of R&D, created a prototype which they presented to Les Paul, the man, in 1951 to both refine and to endorse, as Les Paul was quite a big star at the time and happened to know a thing or two about guitars and how they were made. With the additional input from Les Paul, who had been previously pushing Gibson to manufacture his own solid body creation way back in 1945, affectionately known as the Log, a guitar which they eventually actually ridiculed and eventually passed on. Regardless, within a year of Les Paul coming on board, they had their finished product in the bag and ready for a 1952 release at NAMM. A single cutaway, this guy right here, gold top beauty with 2 single coil P90 pickups, 2 volumes, 2 tone controls, and a 3-way selector switch. This basic design, except for the pickup configuration, which would be switched to 2 double coil humbucker pickups in 1957, hasn't changed a lick in nearly 70 years. Interestingly enough, that switch to humbuckers in 1957, coupled with a new paint scheme, the iconic Sunburst, nearly did the guitar in. Sales tanked for the Les Paul in the latter years of the 50s, forcing Gibson to stop producing the guitar. Without consulting Les Paul, they would redesign the guitar in the early 60s and give the Les Paul a double cutaway with a thinner body and sharper edges. Les Paul, the man, hated it, as do I actually. He lent his name to it for 1 more year, then refused to be associated with the guitar, forcing Gibson to change its name. I think you might know where I'm going with this one as well. It's the SG, aka Solid Guitar. An odd name considering solid guitars had been on the market for over 10 years by this point. Regardless, Solid Guitar wouldn't fare much better initially, but would eventually go on to be Gibson's all-time greatest selling guitar of all time. That actually surprised me. I had no idea that the SG was that popular. I hate SGs. As the 60s got underway, however, the traditional-looking Les Paul was dead. From 1961 to 1968, no Les Pauls were made. The guitar had run its course, or had it. By the mid-60s, some of the biggest name rock stars of the day, such as Keith Richards, Eric Clapton, Mike Bloomfield, they rediscovered the classic guitar from the 50s and had started playing it regularly. By the close of the 60s, that list had grown to include the likes of Jerry Garcia from the Grateful Dead, Jeff Beck, Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac, Paul Kossoff, and of course, Jimmy Page. In 1968, Gibson, no doubt overjoyed with their Dead guitar's newfound success and popularity, especially with some of the most high-profile guitar players in the world at the time, would reintroduce the single cutaway Les Paul to the world, and of course, it remains in production to this very day. Over the years, it would find a whole new generation of guitar devotees, both famous and not so famous, such as myself, I suppose. Those famous ones include the likes of Ace Frehley of Kiss, Slash, Duane Allman, Frank Zappa, Billy Gibbons of ZZ Top, Gary Moore, Randy Rhoads, Pete Townsend, Alex Lifeson, Neil Young, Neil Schon, Zakk Wylde. I could go on all night. A few months ago, with part one of this series, where I took on the Fender Stratocaster, I mentioned that there were far more famous solos played on the Fender Stratocaster than any other guitar, probably by a factor of 10. I just happened to pull that little factoid out of my... I was most definitely wrong about that, I think, in hindsight. In hindsight, I'd have to put the Strat and the Les Paul about on par with each other. It's actually pretty close. And speaking about guitar solos, today we're going to have a look and a playthrough of what I consider to be 5 of the greatest and most iconic Les Paul solos of all time. This is not a definitive top 5, of course. These are simply my own personal favorites. Yet they're all most definitely iconic in nature and should certainly be in anyone's, say, top 25 greatest Les Paul solos of all time. One of which, I'm sure many of you have no idea that it was actually played on a Gibson Les Paul, but we'll get to that one in a minute. So without further ado, let's play some guitar solos, in particular 5 of the greatest Les Paul guitar solos of all time.
And now, before the next show starts, let's enjoy an intermission. You'll find our snack bar chock full of good things to eat and drink. Tasty, tempting hot dogs, thirst-quenching soft drinks.
And coming in at number 5 on my list is a solo by a guy who is without doubt the least known guitar player on this list, but one of the 70s unsung greats and a well-known collector of Gibson Les Pauls throughout the years. And that man's name is Martin Barre, lead guitarist for the seminal 70s rock band, with flutes, Jethro Tull, with one of my absolute favorite classic rock solos and one of the greatest rock guitar solos of all time. This is the solo to Aqualung by Martin Barre and Jethro Tull, played on his beautiful 1958 Les Paul Special.
You poor old sod, you see it's only me. Oh, oh,
Number 4 on my list of iconic Gibson Les Paul solos is by one of my personal favorite guitar players who we sadly lost far too young. As one half of a mutual admiration society between him and Eric Clapton, he was asked to sit in on the recording session for Clapton's Derek and the Dominoes' Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs album, which the band was recording in Florida in 1970. So impressed were everyone, especially Clapton, with his playing. He stayed on for most of the session and contributed his immense guitar skills to nearly every track on the album, most notably to his slide work on this one, Layla. This is Duane Allman and the slide solo to Layla as my number 4 pick, played on his much-loved 57 Les Paul Gold Top, which incidentally just went for a cool $1.25 million at auction last year. My number 3 pick is the one that you may not know was actually played on a Gibson Les Paul. This player, along with the likes of Jimi Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan, was and still is pretty much synonymous with the Fender Stratocaster throughout his entire career. He even played his trusty Stratocaster on this particular track, but not for the solo. For the solo, he used his classic 55 Les Paul Gold Top with its dual single-coil P90 pickups. And that guitar player is David Gilmour, and the solo is the one to Another Brick in the Wall, Part 2. My number 2 pick was a bit of a toss-up. I mean, Slash has to be here, right? But which solo should I choose? I initially decided upon November Rain, but when I really thought about it, I figured that Sweet Child of Mine was the better pick of the two. I honestly think that November Rain is the better and more melodic of the two solos, but when it comes right down to it, Sweet Child of Mine is much more iconic. So Sweet Child of Mine it is. Played oddly enough on a 1959 Les Paul replica copy built for Slash by luthier Chris Derrig in the mid-80s. Now here's a guy, Slash, who would go on to become a spokesman and major endorsee of the Les Paul brand, whose main guitar during his most productive and influential years with Guns N' Roses actually played a Les Paul copy. even on the headstock. Stranger still, Gibson in the future would actually come out with a very expensive official Gibson replica of Slash's fake Les Paul replica. How bizarre is that? Anyway, this is the solo to Sweet Child of Mine as my number 2 pick. Now, of course, number 1 has to be Jimmy Page, but it's not. Yes, it is. Oh, I cracked myself up. But the big question is which solo to choose. Stairway to Heaven? Well, actually, that was played on a Fender Telecaster. Heartbreaker? As shocking to the ears as that solo is in the middle of that song, I honestly don't think that it's Jimmy Page's best solo. It's a fantastic solo, but it's a bit of a mess. I still love it, however. But so what do I think is Jimmy Page's best solo? Well, I'm gonna tell you what I think Jimmy Page's best solo is, and then I'm going to play it for you. But first, I'm going to pull one on you because I just said with Slash, by putting Sweet Child of Mine at number 2, that Sweet Child of Mine was more iconic, but November Rain was the better solo, and that's why I chose Sweet Child of Mine. But now, as my number 1, I'm going to do just the opposite. I believe that Heartbreaker is the more iconic solo, but this one is the better solo of the two, and it's this one that I'm going to go with as my favorite Les Paul solo of all time. So without further ado, this is Jimmy Page on his 1959 Les Paul, the one he affectionately refers to as Les Paul number 1. This is Since I've Been Loving You, both intro and main solo, because they're both bloody fantastic. But before that, and before I go, I just want to say thanks, as always, for watching. Hope you're well in your little guitar corner of the world. If you're not subscribed, please subscribe. That would be awfully nice. And we'll see you next time. Take care of yourselves. Cheers.